Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Lena. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our disability speaker series here at NeuroNav. I imagine everyone who is joining is aware of who we are. But I'm Kim, our CEO and one of the founders of NeuroNav. And just for context, NeuroNav offers person-centered planning and independent facilitation services to really support curating services for developmentally disabled adults. And so I'm really delighted to be here today and to welcome everyone to our inaugural speaker series. This really came about because our team meets monthly to talk about ableism and different topics in the disability community and the change that we hope to see in the world. And we talked about bringing in amazing speakers to help share stories around inclusion and share stories around how we can help our community. So one of the first people I thought of as we envisioned this series is my friend and colleague, Micaela Connery. Micaela and I met about 3 or 4 years ago as we both were working in the disability space. And I was so inspired by Micaela's vision for the Kelsey as a really inclusive, mixed ability, mixed income model for housing. And so I'm so delighted to have Micaela here today and Fatimah from her team as well. And I also would love to give a huge shout out to Lena from our team, who is one of our amazing service navigators and on the side has, through passion, helped create this program. So thank you so much, Lena, for all the hard work putting this together. We'll be sharing this video on YouTube, so feel no need to take notes. You'll have access to the content, and we really appreciate you being here today.
Yay, thank you for that, Kim. So before our panelists begin speaking, we just wanted to talk about like some webinar norms and accessibility. Participate in whatever way works best for you. Cameras off, cameras on, snack, stretch, whatever helps you kind of, take up the content. We ask that you kindly mute yourself while the panelists are presenting, but we want to hear from you. So there will be a Q&A at the end where you can, unmute and ask questions, type in the chat, whatever works best. And then in terms of accessibility, as Kim mentioned, this will be recorded so that people who couldn't join will be able to, reference it. And then we have enabled closed captioning so that, you can kind of follow along the live transcript. And let's go ahead and introduce our two panelists. So Micaela has co-founded the Kelsey with her cousin, who I know continues to inspire and inform the mission work that they do today. She has been working on inclusion her whole life. She is a proud University of Virginia Wahoo, and then completed her MBA as a Mitchell Scholar at University College Dublin, has a master's in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, has done research on housing and disability. And prior to the Kelsey, Micaela was the founder of the founder and CEO of Unified Theater. So really great to have you here, Micaela. Fatimah is the Kelsey's Director of Field Building Capacity. Hello, Fatimah. You have your communication degree from Northwestern, a public policy master's from UC Berkeley. I know that managing, meaningful nonprofit work is a sweet spot for you. And, you lead the efforts to grow the field of leaders in this space. So welcome both of you. I hope I got those bios right. There was a lot to pull from. You have a lot of great experience. And I will pass it to Micaela right now to present on introducing the Kelsey.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lena and Kim. And I forgot that in that bio that Kim and I also share both being UVA alums, which is fun and kind of random and here in California, but really fun to share the space with you all and your work at NeuroNav. So I'm going to kick us off by just sharing some basics on the Kelsey, and then we're also going to dive into one of our newer programs that Fatimah leads here, our Housing Design Standards for Accessibility and Inclusion. So as a preview of where we're going to go and try to go through those, not quickly, but to really spend time having a conversation too about, what questions you have and reactions and thoughts as it relates to your own work or experience in this space. So I'll jump right into it. Let me just share my screen. I very rarely speak with slides, so I'm going to try my best and we'll see how it goes. My name, as Lena mentioned, is Micaela, and I started this work at the Kelsey with my cousin who had multiple significant disabilities, and still very much she is a part of this work, but also a lot of the things that she embodied during her life and that are still embedded within our mission at the Kelsey, both co-leadership of people with and without disabilities, and also cross-disability access and inclusion, making sure that we don't limit community-based inclusion to people with certain types of disabilities, but actually make community-based inclusion truly possible for everyone. So we can talk more about what that means, but Kelsey is still very much a part of our work in those ways that she led during her lifetime. So the Kelsey's mission in this way is to pioneer disability forward housing solutions with the belief that doing so not only meets that unmet and critically overlooked need, but actually is an opportunity to create better housing and better opportunities for all people. And so that's really threaded throughout our work at the Kelsey. Some of this might not be news to folks working in this space, but of the 1 in 4 people who have a disability, their basic housing needs continue to go unmet and generally are unaddressed in mainstream housing policy. That's something we're trying to change, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But when we think about the lack of housing for adults with disabilities, we really look at it in kind of 4 key areas. The fact that folks are priced out, so they can't afford their housing. The fact that folks, when they even can afford their housing, often, or even if they can't afford their housing, often the housing is not physically or otherwise accessible. And Fatimah will share more on the broad definition of accessibility and cross-disability accessibility as we think about it, the Kelsey. Still direct discrimination and bias and segregation and institutional bias and embedded medical models, and especially around intersectional identities for people of color with disabilities, particularly Black and Brown people with disabilities. So even if the cost and the access is there, there's also just straight up discrimination and bias. And then all of that leads to the fact that there's just not enough homes that are community-based for people with disabilities. And depending on what data you look at and what state, it's somewhere between less than 6 to somewhere that only 6 to 12% of people with disabilities who use supportive services or otherwise own or rent their own home. And I will just say that as we talk about this work, like the data is actually something that's kind of lacking in an area that we're actually trying to work on a little bit more. So a lot of our data that we're sharing here is like copied from reference from a lot of different reports, and noting that everywhere defines disability a little differently. So when it's the case that there's a subcategory that this stat is drawn on of within disability, I'll try to name that, but just to note that disability is also an under-researched and resourced in research area. And so these are the housing barriers that people with disabilities face. And actually, the lack of integrated inclusive housing and continued reliance on more segregated and institutional models only affirms that problem. And so we really anchor our work in inclusion and think about how we go from what was historically segregated models, where people with disabilities are actually just outside of the mainstream or siloed off into their own, that we've made some strides towards what we would say are integrated models where, and that is an important step in the right direction, where people with and without disabilities are physically a part of the same community and sharing community together. That's step one. And then really the goal, though, that we define at the Kelsey is truly inclusive models, where people share experiences, people share community, people are equally valued and contributing and able to have the same opportunities in the same spaces and experiences. And I say same in a careful way of it's not truly equal, but equitable. And that means, thinking about how thoughtfully to create spaces where people can access at the level they need, two different experiences that supports are built in, that, you know, affirmative strategies are taken to actually undo systemic bias to make it a more inclusive experience, that that's, you know, a quite integration, you know, is about getting people in the same space. Inclusion is about doing that, and, you know, building in the programs and services and structures to actually make that experience inclusive. And a lot of the work that folks do to that, you know, we are a housing developer, which I'll share more on, but that's also in partnership with community providers and organizations and families and service providers to make that inclusion possible. And so how we define housing is really thinking about taking both of those things, building something that's affordable to people across all incomes, including extremely low income, all the way up to moderate and missing middle, as they call it, housing. So like workforce housing, more accessible to meet cross-disability access and person-centered design, which Fatimah will be sharing more on. And then more inclusive, where people can really have access to the services and community that they desire to thrive, that getting a home is the first step, and that the inclusivity is the continued work that needs to be done. And I will note that we think about this in our work too, of that affordability is essentially a financing problem. We need to have money to finance these communities and make these developments possible, or be able to help people pay for their housing that they need. Accessibility is really about the built environment. That's a design question of how we locate, how we design, how we build communities. And then inclusivity is really an operations question about, you know, culture and services and operations and programs and amenities that happen once the building is occupied. And those are different phases of the housing development process, but you can anchor in inclusion and inclusivity at each of those phases to really make a completely inclusive community. We have two developments underway here in the Bay Area, as well as a pilot community in Oakland that's operating now, that we actually have homes available if that's of interest. Our first two communities are mixed income affordable homes, meaning that they include rents from people who are SSI reliant, all the way up to, like I said, workforce middle income housing, with 25% of the homes explicitly reserved for people with disabilities who use supportive services. From a cross-disability perspective, because I think it's relevant to this group, when we define use supportive services, we're looking at people who use HCBS services and purposefully trying to expand outside of only regional center clients. So recognizing that it's cross disability, so not just people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but that will be, I imagine, a large portion of our residents with disabilities, but not limited to that. And then our pilot community is a market rate building, so it doesn't achieve that same end goal of deep affordability that our ground up developments do, but similarly, you know, community-based, fully inclusive, with access to programs and services. And I, you know, will note that also it's important to just like name what we've done, and Kim knows this, and my feeling on this space is like, you know, a lot of times we're like, that's affordable or it's inclusive, and it's like actually not. So like we'll name very like clearly, all three of these communities are inclusive. The first two communities have deep accessibility built into the design and affordability. The third community, Atlas at Oakland, is inclusive. It has some accessibility of basic sort of like code requirements, and it's not affordable. So like we should just be honest about what we're building and for whom we're able to serve, given that. And so that's what our communities are. Embedded in this is our theory of change, which is this idea that if you think back 3 slides, we have 61 million Americans with disabilities. We are deeply proud, and we'll share some metrics of what we've achieved in the last 3.5 years of operations. 4 years of operations, is that right? But we, you know, 200 plus homes is really exciting and remarkable, and much, you know, faster than anybody who's operating in this space. And it's a drop in the bucket related to the need that's there. And so we embed within our theory of change this idea of building communities and changing systems, recognizing that we are never going to solve this challenge 100 or 200 or even 1,000 homes at a time. That's not gonna measurably impact a disability forward housing future. And so we take what we do in these communities we build and use that to inform policy advocacy, open sourcing resources, playbooks like the design standards, which you'll hear more about, technical assistance, field building and capacity building, leadership development, all the things that need to happen so that there are now the market conditions and policies and structures so that other people can build inclusive housing at scale. And that's really fundamental to our work, is open sourcing, everything of what we do, being transparent about what has worked and what doesn't, and really building the capacity of our field, both in advocacy and in other programmatic areas, so that the Kelsey, is not a one of a kind or, a only kind of special different thing, but that we're really bringing a whole field along with us of others who can do this work as well. I wanted to just share this quick slide to just because, I knew this was sort of a service provider audience, to just talk about a little bit. This is a graphic we use if you ask, what are these communities and like, how are they actually inclusive? What we think about a lot is this idea of a triangle of community living, is something, a framework that we use at the Kelsey, which is the idea that if we think of any of our lives, we have these two things that need to be stable for us to, stand on our ground, which is physical housing, a space to live, and the services and supports that allow us to live healthy, safe, happy lives. And that both of those, when those two things are stabilized, that's where we then have access to true community, whether that's, worship and jobs and recreation and friendships and family and, neighborhood and all the things, sports, whatever it is that, makes community for you. That's the ultimate goal, but we need to stabilize these housing and supportive services to be able to help people access that community and that life that they desire. The Kelsey heavily focuses in on the housing supply. We are essentially very anchored in on housing supply and doing housing supply in a way that's informed to the services that our residents will access in the future. And what that looks like at the Kelsey is really three things specifically. One is we define something called service-linked, service-ready housing. So we are not a service provider, but we talk to people with disabilities who use services as well as service providers during our development process, so that we understand what kinds of service systems our folks are going to access, and making sure that the housing is built to work with that or even enhance the services that an individual receives. We provide space on site for programming and support staff that are built into the buildings, whether that space is for community gathering and events, or spaces for residents to meet with their care team, or spaces for service providers to go and work in between supporting multiple residents in a building, or spaces for overnight staff or other things where people can be within the building, but not necessarily supporting a resident in their unit, but not necessarily sitting in that unit staring at a resident. And so those kind of physical spaces to support service delivery. And then the third thing is our inclusion concierge, our individuals who live and work in the community and help connect our residents to each other, to the services and their neighborhood. A lot of our work is built in partnership. I've talked a lot about this. You can find more and learn about our partnerships at thekelsey.org/newsletter, and sign up and hear about kind of the things and the programs and events that we're doing. And there's also a lot of other information on our website. And, noting some of our metrics to date, I've shared a few of these, but we're, really proud of where we've come so far, and also recognizing that there's a lot more work to be done in this. So thank you for taking the time to learn about us, and I will kick it over to Fatimah, if I can stop sharing my screen, to kick it over to Fatimah to talk about one of our really key both field building and, housing focused initiatives, which is our housing design standards for accessibility and inclusion. So I will let Fatimah go ahead and share that.
Hold on 1 second. Okay. Can you guys, oh wait, I just stopped. Hold on, sorry. Okay, share, and then I want to now. I totally lost my hold on. You guys are so patient. Hold on.
Fatimah, and if you tell me what deck it is, I'm happy to pull that up too, if that's easier, so that you can start.
Here, is it this? No. It was the NeuroNav design standards overview.
Perfect. If you stop sharing, I'll pull that up and you can start.
Okay. Thanks for being patient with me, guys.
No problem.
And while we have a moment, just want to encourage everyone. Thank you, Micaela, for that overview. As you have questions, feel free to add them to the chat because we'll have a period of Q&A in about 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So do you mind advancing the slides for me?
No problem.
Okay. So hi and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this speaker series. I really just wanted to do as broad an overview as possible of the housing and design standards for accessibility and inclusion, which the Kelsey came up with in partnership with Eric Mickelton of Mickelton Architecture, as well as an inclusive design council made up of people all over the country. But I will get back to that. If you can advance, I'll go on to, so Micaela kind of stole my thunder. These are some of the same statistics that she was talking about. But again, just to paint a picture of the problems that we're trying to address with the design standards, 1 in 4 people in the US has a disability. And like Micaela said, somewhere between 6 and 12% of the housing that is available is accessible. And lastly, there were only 11% of people with disabilities who rent or own their home, which is astounding and a little bit coloring kind of why it was that we thought it was so important to come up with the design standards. You can advance. Okay. So just a little bit about, we came up with the design standards, which are a set of over 300 design elements that were specific to accessibility and inclusion. And we wanted to equip developer designers and architects with this remarkable tool that really gets at 2 of the 3 pillars of the Kelsey, which are accessibility and inclusion. You can advance. So a little bit about what they are, and Micaela spoke to this a little bit. So one thing that I'm super proud of is that these design standards are cross disability. I think a lot of us, when we think of accessibility, the first thing we think of is a wheelchair, and is there a ramp, is there an elevator, which is very important. I have my own, my disability is one that involves mobility, but cross disability really gets at the access needs of people with a variety of different disabilities. And I'll get to that. We can put a pin in it. The other thing that the design standards are multi-dimensional, implementable and expandable. And then the selling point that we love to give architects and designers is value creation. And their ears definitely perk up when you talk about cost savings and ways to really bring down the budget. These things are important because we wanted the design standards to be implementable and actually actionable, like not so hard that it would be beyond the realm of something that you can institute. You can advance. A quick, so I talked about what they are. I also want to talk about what they're not. So these design standards are not a code requirement or something that will override what the code is in local jurisdictions. You still have to adhere to what the building code says when you are developing housing. Another thing they're not is, another thing they are not is a replacement for engaging individuals with disabilities or with lived experiences that match the kind of the future residents that you hope to house eventually. This is not a replacement, so you still have to go into the community and do focus groups, workshops, and really get feedback and insight from the people that you want to house eventually. And lastly, the design standards are not at all complete. So this is a first iteration, and we want to continue to iterate people's examples about what we should be doing. So don't think of this as a finished product, but rather the first of many revisions. Okay, you can advance. So I spoke a little bit about the team of people that helped to come up with the design standards, which were a lot of work, and we want to always give credit where credit is due in terms of the people who helped us along this journey. So I already talked about Eric Micaela. He's from Micaela Architecture, and he's actually an architect who has disabilities himself. The Inclusive Design Council is made up of people across the country who have disabilities, and they're really at the cross section of design, architecture, and advocacy. And then lastly, we work with a lot of partner organizations. And so we do workshops as well as one-on-one consultations with these partners. You could then. So this is a great kind of snapshot of what each element looks like. And again, this is something that we desire to equip architects, designers, and developers in developing more accessible and inclusive housing. And this just gives you a great snapshot of kind of the text about what the design element is, as well as the access area or the different ways in which we organize the standards. And I'll talk about that a little later. You can advance. So the first way that these design standards are organized is by design category. And this is really something that gives a snapshot of from start to finish, and every level in between about when you're developing housing. So they start with the design process, which is very early on. The site, the building exterior, building components, interior spaces, dwelling units, and operations and amenities, which comes at the very end. But this is one of the ways that we have chosen to organize the elements, because like I said, there are over 300. So we don't want people to get overwhelmed, but this is a helpful way that we've chosen to organize based on like the point that you're at with your development. Okay, you can advance. I talked about the impact areas, which can also be called access need areas. And I already talked about my mobility access needs, but they go far beyond mobility and include mobility and height, hearing and acoustics, vision, health and wellness, cognitive access, as well as support needs. So this is another, you can also organize the design standards by the impact area or access need area that they're connected to. And each of the elements address either one or more of these different impact areas. Okay, advance. Are you okay? Someone's coughing. And lastly, we have additional benefits, which I think are greatly important. I talked before about 2 of the 3 pillars of the Kelsey disability forward housing. And the 3rd pillar is here, which is affordability. Additional benefits also include racial equity, environmental sustainability, safety, and better design. So these are another set of areas that you can organize the standards around. And they're ones that are very important to the Kelsey as an organization, as well as creating a truly inclusive housing development. And so, oh, thank you. No, you can advance. Kelsey.
I ended my share, 1 sec. There we go.
Okay. No worries.
You're back.
So I did want to talk about the kelsey.org/design is a place that you can access the design standards at any point. We just need your name, email, and the zip code that you're in, because we want to track where the interest in our different resources like the design standards are coming from. So we encourage everyone to go to our website and download this free resource, because I really feel strongly that everyone should have access and know about the standards and how transformational they can be. So please go to our website and download the standards today. You can advance. I'm a little curious about what's at the end. Oh, this is another great example of how the design standards are organized and presented. So each one will have a number, and they will have an area that highlights the impact area, additional benefits, and the category that they fall into. And we also include pictures or descriptions and the element group, so that you can easily find an element that you're looking for. You can advance. And this is just a lovely list of some of the values that we hold dear at the Kelsey. And the ones that stick out to me are inclusive and diverse, because, you know, sadly, disabilities is not something that just affects one community or one group of people, but it's a much more broad. So I just wanted to give a brief overview, and I really would love to jump into questions that make this more of a conversation. But thank you for advancing my slides, and I would love to answer any questions that anyone has.
Thank you so much, Fatimah and Micaela. Really appreciate the overview. And I'm going to give everyone some time to think through their questions in chat. I see we already have one question. And as folks are kind of thinking through their questions, and Caroline Griffin, I will add your question in just a sec. I also just had a question to kick us off, so people can write their questions in chat. I was curious, so a lot of the design principles that you shared, I know were based on a lot of work and experience and thinking through these large scale inclusive apartment buildings that could be created and designed. You also mentioned, Micaela, of the diversity of housing that's needed and meeting people in their community where they're at. We have families every day seeking housing solutions and wanting to live in their own community. I'm curious how you respond to individuals who are looking for inclusive housing options or considering creating their own housing project in their neighborhood. And what should they be looking out for? Should they be thinking as they try to balance these principles of affordability and inclusivity?
I will talk about the individuals, and Fatimah, maybe then you can share about our newest resource in the Learn Center, or the second newest, the one about first 5 steps. So just on the individual outreach, I will just say, first of all, that like, that's probably one of the hardest parts of our job, is that people reach out to us saying like, can you find me housing like today? And the short answer is like, we can't. And like, that's just, we are not a housing navigator. We are, not like immediately able to provide housing. Like we, have a resource on our website of like things to do if you're looking for housing, but like, I'll just name that that's like a big challenge of our work. And we sort of created a model to focus on, what we see as a key part of the field. But we do provide a lot of technical assistance, both paid and unpaid. So like, paid technical assistance is working with other developers who have a project that they need support on and like don't have the capacity of a staff to do that and want to sort of bring somebody along who's done this before. And we have clients, all over California who take advantage of that, as well as people nationally. And then so that those are like actual projects that will kind of run a part of a development process for somebody. And a lot of those people are family members or service providers who are looking to build housing for the people they serve or their family members. And then we also open source resources in our Learn Center. And I'll let Fatimah share more about what the Learn Center is and what's up there right now.
Great, thank you. So our Learn Center is really kind of a library of resources, different articles that include templates, toolkits, and best practices of kind of doing this work. And like Micaela said, what has worked and what hasn't. And the piece that she's talking about is around kind of wanting to develop disability forward housing and advising people on what their first 5 steps should be. We get a lot of feedback from people in the community, and they're like, what you've done is great. We want to replicate it here in Colorado or in Boston or, in Alabama. And so the first 5 steps article is really great for people that know that they want to develop housing in some way, but have no idea where to start. And so this article kind of holds your hand and walks you through what those first 5 steps should be and what you should be thinking about when it comes to developing truly inclusive housing. And again, the Learn Center is free and available on our website for anyone that wants to peruse what we have on there. But we try to make the pieces that are in the Learn Center very relevant and applicable to questions that people actually have.
Awesome. And I can jump into maybe some of these questions in the chat. Is that helpful? And I can read them aloud, or how do you want to do that, Lena?
That would be great. Yeah, I had them highlighted to read however we want to break that down.
Cool. So the first question is around the application process. So I'll first answer the unit type, which is that we, for the most part, try to practice universal design, meaning that all units are similarly designed to meet cross disability accessibility. But sometimes universal design, as you note, Fatimah didn't use that term throughout the design standards presentation, because universal design is a little bit of a misnomer, because things are not universal. In fact, there are times where there are competing access needs. And so one thing that we do not have in all of our units, for example, is the only kind of feature that differs in our units in the ground up developments we're doing is roll-in showers. Not all units have roll-in showers because they, one, are difficult to do. And two, actually, we did hear from people that at times, like certain folks actually prefer a tub, or roll-in showers bring some other challenges with wetness and other things in the bathroom. And so anyway, they're, for the most part, other than that, all the units are exactly laid out the same. And we talk about that with visitability too, so that it should be the case that even if you don't use a wheelchair, that your neighbor should be able to come visit you who uses a wheelchair and get into your apartment and use the bathroom. They just might not be able to shower. That's the visitability piece, that people can come over for a dinner party, maybe not live there. So just around they're not matched in that way. And then the application process will be a lottery where people will be dual qualified based on income and our disability qualifier, which is actually based on service delivery system. Do they qualify as an HCBS recipient, whether regional center or IHSS or otherwise? And a lottery is also really key. I'll just name that here, because one of the things that I saw in doing research is that a lot of housing developments focused on disability inclusion do wait lists. And the wait lists are, beneficial to the person who can show up in line first on the day that wait list opens, whether physically or virtually. And there are a lot of issues with kind of equity that come into that. And so for the application process, we'll practice really intentional affirmative marketing within, particularly underserved communities. And then after that affirmative marketing, have a lottery system so that everyone has the equal chance, not just based on if they happen to have a job or a lifestyle where they could be online at 6 a.m. to be the first on the wait list. And then what is your partnership with the regional centers? So they are in both of our projects, they play a role in tenant referral. So they're housing navigators. That's one of our qualifiers that, like I said, we have beyond regional center, but that they'll be able to qualify residents. So we'll use regional center partners to help refer eligible residents into the units and then ultimately confirm their eligibility. We are very excited to also say that the Golden Gate Regional Center is actually funding our project in San Francisco through their Community Resource Development Program. So that's a DDS program, and they are funding our project there. And that was just approved by their board last week. So that's super exciting. That will come out in our field notes tomorrow. So y'all are the first to know. And so, yeah, that's kind of what our partnership looks like with them. Awesome. And then Yadira, how can individuals who are looking for or looking to advocate for more accessible housing options in their area use your work to that? So I think a couple of things. One is, again, on the Learn Center, we do have some resources on there around like things to think about when advocating for inclusive, accessible, and affordable housing. I'll share like broadly that, we actually have like advocacy programs that people get involved in. We ran a Raise the Roof program for disabled leaders in housing. We have a California working group around housing and disability. And then we're also now part of a national collaborative around economic justice, of which housing is a key part. So there's like some, ways to plug in like that. On an individual basis, it's funny, and thank you for that question. Our manager of advocacy and organizing has talked about sharing more resources of like, what can an individual do like in their town or community to, work to advance more accessible options. And that resource is probably forthcoming, but I'll just share what she shares with folks when they ask that, which is one, like kind of the agitator of going and making sure that when your county or city or state is making decisions around housing, that they're adding an inclusive lens to that. And that might mean naming the housing needs of people with disabilities in your housing element, which California uses to really define what housing gets built in an individual area. Housing Choices, who's based in San Jose, does some really great advocacy around housing element advocacy, where people kind of agitate to make sure disability is named within housing elements and therefore set the framework for future investments in that area. Another thing is to encourage, more subsidy for affordable housing, and in that to encourage incentives for people to do disability inclusion. So, we have a city that's applying our housing design standards for accessibility and inclusion, where if you apply for funding in that city, you get extra points if you use these. And so having ways like that people add in specific incentives to encourage those people who are developing housing in that city to be more disability forward. And then I'd also just say, like, the third thing is just getting involved in quote unquote mainstream housing advocacy, either as a person with disabilities or an ally around disability issues. There's just like often people are convening on those tables, whether they're EMB groups or neighborhood groups or whatever it is. And really getting, those groups to actually, talk about disability, include disability within the lens of the other housing issues that they're addressing, be more disability forward, and have representation of disabled people in those spaces. And so, being really infiltrate those spaces is where it's needed. And I always have to make this plug in California, in general, being pro-housing. So if you are anti-development, you are anti-accessibility, because historically old housing stock is less accessible. So if you're saying, we don't want affordable housing or any housing or even market rate housing where we live, you're actually saying that we don't want more housing for people with disabilities. So you got to be pro-housing wherever you live. And of all types, we need all types of housing, net new supply. And so being pro that, and then adding the disability inclusion lens to it.
Micaela, can I just add one thing?
Yeah. I just went like a runaway train on those, Fatimah, so fill in anything.
I don't know how it skipped over this slide, but I did want to talk about ways that people can get involved with the design standards. And I'll lift up two things. So one is really just to look at the standards, download them, and give feedback, whether it's qualitative or just, we're also accepting copy edits, but we really want these design standards to be useful to people. So the best way for you to go about it is really to give us feedback and insights on maybe areas that we missed or areas that we should give more attention to. And the last is just to share. So we want everybody in the disability community, obviously architects and developers, but also people within the community that have the lived experience that is mentioned and gives credence to accessibility and inclusion. So give feedback and then share the standards is a great way to get involved.
And I see Jennifer's question around the aging and changing needs. So I also just will note, like I mentioned, our communities are, in construction phases. So I can't talk to you about currently live at the Kelsey. But I can share with you just one, a couple things as it relates to that. One is, inclusivity in the accessible design choices also supports aging in place and people being able to stay where they live. So and that includes cross disability accessibility. So that's a key piece. Somebody might not need some of these features now, but they might need them in the future. And then, this is less around like a specific thing to respond, but more of like embedded in our approach is this idea of supporting people with multiple significant disabilities, including who are medically fragile or have enhanced behavior support needs. That's like, and that's an area Kim and I have talked about a lot, is like our field has been relatively bifurcated between people with moderate to less support needs and people with more significant support needs. And notice it's that's really about, not who the people are, but what their level of support is. And we've sort of made systems where this space is accessible to people who are relatively independent, whatever the hell that means. And so, and frankly, why design something just for people who are relatively independent? That makes no sense to me. And so it really is important that we anchor our development and our operations on making sure that things are accessible to people with higher support needs. And I say that as also personal bias. That was what, Kelsey lived with. And so it really drove me bananas when she was in her own housing journey and people said, well, this kind of community isn't for people like Kelsey. And I know that that was a difficulty for her. And so that includes things like I mentioned, that sort of service linked housing, and super intentional about that, having the inclusion concierge, so just an extra layer of service support, having the, more universally designed spaces, recognizing, people who use wheelchairs or have other medical considerations, and space for those equipment and those needs. And it looks like just anchoring that and naming that all the time. So not marketing your building as saying, this is for people who can bring a certain level of their own, not needing support, that we really want to make sure that we're scaffolding in. And I admit that we haven't operated yet. So I imagine that's going to be difficult. And I imagine that there are going to be people for whom like they need to build in support systems and scaffolding. But let's just be committed to that up front and build in the staff and the budget and the systems to be able to make that possible. And so that's something we're deeply committed to here, and we've embedded into our approach.
Thank you for that, Micaela. I know it's almost 3:30, time is flying. We have about 5 more minutes. So if anyone has additional questions, comments, thank you both for this presentation. It's so informative. You covered a lot of the questions I wanted to ask, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, definitely we also, if you're based here in the Bay Area, I'll just do a little plug that we also do these events that are built into our building or into our communities called inclusion hours. Those are, I'm just looking at the website right now. So those are going to be programs that are run within our communities around building communities, centering access, education around disability justice, and just like fun things to bring people together. And we call those inclusion hours. And we actually have one on Friday with a friend of the Kelsey, Reed Davenport, who's a really remarkable filmmaker. And he has a new film that came out called I Didn't See You There. And he is going to be there for a little happy hour. And then it's playing at the San Francisco Film Fest. So then we're going to head over and see the film. So if you are interested, you can sign up at thekelsey.org/event. The inclusion hour, the happy hour is free before, and then you buy your own ticket to the show. So would love to have any and all of you join.
Micaela, I had one quick question for you. You were talking about the disability community kind of being bifurcated in these 2 ways. What are your thoughts around why that has happened?
That's a great question. I think one is it's like we see this in a lot of other spaces where people who have more significant support needs beyond disability, like we see this as like in education, like, we tend to want to like, level people off and sort of like separate them. That I think that's just like our natural tendency, which is also why our natural tendency is somewhat segregated. And so I think that's one thing, is that's like a beyond disability issue, but like, I want to, and it's like a deeply capitalist way too, of like, and this is, if you aren't educated on systems of disability justice, which we are constantly educating and learning ourselves on, there's a lot of true anti-capitalism in what is truly a disability just way. The Kelsey is not an anti-capitalist org. We work in a very capitalist space, so we cannot claim to be that. However, we should think about these things and be thoughtful about what that means. And, something around our capitalist society sort of measures people and separates people based on their level of productivity. And so I think that is like a first piece of, trying to like segregate people out of like fitting them into their sort of box of productivity, more or less, and defining their experience based on that. That's beyond disability. That's flawed across a lot of systems. And then I do think there is, and I think this is a part of the Kelsey that we think a lot about, is this co-leadership among people with and without disabilities and what that means and looks like. because I've had really, I don't currently live with a disability, and I've had really honest conversations, you know, whether with you, Fatimah, or others on our team or others in the space, around the really powerful and essential self-advocacy movement in our country, but that often a lot of the folks who have been supported within self-advocacy or leading self-advocacy have fewer support needs. And you know, our solution to solve that has been a really unfortunate, almost divisive, like we have disabled self-advocates, like speaking around community-based, integrated, inclusive approaches from their own lived experience in an incredibly powerful and transformative way. And then we have this group of care providers and family members who are saying like, well, my, you know, family member is not represented in that group. And, you know, my family member who, you know, Kelsey did not use verbal communication. She wasn't super involved in self-advocacy. She had many other ways of advocating for herself and her circles where she operated, and much to teach community, but she wasn't showing up at, you know, the Rhode Island State Capitol. And so, you know, we've created this almost divisive piece of, this group doesn't represent me, but you don't represent me, and going back and forth. And so I'm really proud of one of the ways in which the Kelsey has anchored, and like, those two things need not be separated. You can hold space for both at the same time, where you center disabled advocates who should be the leading voices and perspectives on disability rights and disability program development, and have space for family members and care providers and other people to also be providing, you know, allied level contributions to how the field needs to, you know, support cross disability inclusion, including higher support needs. So I think it's a complicated, like, long embedded piece, and it just requires us to also name. I think that's also the last thing I'll say is around like transparency in our field, like of not sort of, you know, happy washing all of our programs and saying we're a disability inclusive org and we serve everybody perfectly. Like no, like if you're not, if you have done that, you're lying. We haven't served everyone perfectly. We're, you know, getting through that. And so being honest about what access needs you're meeting and what access needs you're not, and how affordable you are, how accessible you are, how inclusive you are, because when we all sort of, you know, use these euphemism terms of, you know, inclusive and diverse and home for all, when we're not actually doing that, it doesn't actually help our movement to be specific on what it is that we're trying to do and who we're doing it for.
Love that so much. We're at time, but I'm so glad that, oh, my apologies. I'm so glad that I'm so glad that we were able to kind of hear that comment, because you know, what we've talked about in the last hour, there's so many layers, there's so much history, there's such an integration between policy and economics. And, you know, at the end of the day, it affects individuals, and it affects the folks that we serve, and it should be designed for and by the end user, or the person that this all affects. So I think that was a huge and powerful note to kind of share around that radical transparency and talk about that history, because we have to move forward together to see the change in this space that we really want. And I know that our team is buzzing. I've seen so many comments coming in of excitement and wanting to share resources about the Kelsey, and, you know, get on the project wait list and go to these events. So I just thank you so much for being a thought partner for the work that you all are doing in this space, and just for the openness to share your ideas, so that you know, there isn't this continued designing of housing solutions without all those lessons of how to really make them inclusive and serve who they're meant to serve. So I appreciate so much you guys taking the time and being a part of this series. I'm excited to share the resources, and thank you all for everyone who tuned in and joined us here today. Really appreciate you all making the time.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For everyone. Bye.